we can record.
Is this? Maybe we'll start, see what happens. Right, good evening, everyone.
Hi everyone.
Obviously, this is all a bit of a learning curve for all, so apologies if this is not 100% successful, but we'll make sure that at some point there is something filmed and online for you to be able to use for revision purposes. So if this is all a horrible failure, well, firstly, you can blame me. But secondly, it is a learning curve for us all, and then hopefully in the long run it'll make your revision life easier and something that you can kind of revisit and use at your leisure at the time that will suit you. Okay, so wish us luck. So anyway, this evening, Inspector Call's theme, we're having a look at probably a literature text a week between now and the ominous date in the future. And so the first one we're going to look at this week, sort of following on from bits we've been doing in class, is Inspector Calls. Okay, and we're going to look at sort of similar angle to some of the things that perhaps previously, but with a slightly different kind of, twinge on this one. And this week we're going to focus on guilt and morality.
So I think we all know that the most common reading of Inspector Calls is that this is a play all about social responsibility, and that's true. But it is more than just a play about social responsibility, and at the heart of everything that Priestley is trying to teach us is a universal understanding of morality. Obviously, guilt is a big part of how we understand our morality, and I think he really wants us to ask that question of why do people sometimes feel guilt about their actions whilst others don't, and how do we learn to be better people unless we feel guilt and can reflect on our morality. So what we're hoping is that today might give you a few more avenues to go down in an essay rather than relying exclusively on the age-old argument about social responsibility, that you can get more depth by arguing that guilt and morality are also at the heart of this play.
Yeah, we were always trying to find an edge. We always want to make ourselves stand out. You want your examiner, I know this is very sort of cynical and very deliberate, but you want them to be surprised at some of the things you say. They're going to read a lot of essays and they're going to say a lot of similar things. And so therefore, at least this gives you nuance. This might be an opportunity for your alternative arguments and so forth. Okay, so but one of the perks here is that this is a theme, as it says on the board there. Board, go on, take me out of the classroom. That a theme that underpins the entire play. And we've talked before in lesson, we did something about talking about the human condition, and I think that's something to bear in mind when you look at this, that this is a play that talks about human morality in general, irrespective of kind of, religious ideas, but this is something that we all face, and our questions with morals, where they're shaped, how they're shaped, and perhaps also some of the blurred lines between legality and morality, and that these two things are not necessarily linked at all, as I'm sure you're all aware. There's not a lot of illegal behaviour in this. I know there's one or two fairly notable exceptions later in the play, but most of the actions by the characters are ultimately legal. They're just not necessarily moral.
So Priest is essentially encouraging his audience to not just understand the importance of social responsibility, but also to reflect on previous actions. And essentially the whole play is designed to bring the audience, by the end of the play, to reflect upon their own actions and moral judgments.
Especially sort of that Edwardian audience. Remember, keep thinking about a context and what they've been through, and perhaps why they're in a place societally to kind of reflect more on their moral behaviours after what's gone on in the intervening years. So we're going to start with sort of some practical stuff here. Okay, I mean, we sincerely hope you're all very much aware now that there will be two choices of question. Okay, it's the first question in the exam, literature paper 2, worth 34 marks, 4 of them for Spag. Don't forget the E on Priestley, so we should all be pretty familiar with that. The marking system is the same as in, frankly, most of your English literature essays. AO1, your content, your knowledge, your ideas. AO2, your analysis. Don't forget that one. It can be an easy overlook on Inspector Calls because it doesn't lead itself perhaps to being analysed in the same way that more floral language of Shakespeare and things perhaps does. AO3 context, and this one does carry those Spag marks, so if you're ever going to revisit a question, then this is going to be one to look at. And Miss, you were going to say something about the sort of slightly newer way that the exam would have been doing the question.
Yeah, so there seems to be a movement towards either a 2-character focus. I'm thinking of last year in the question on Gerald and Sheila's relationships. You can see that there they are providing 2 characters to have to focus on. And there's also been a tendency to move towards character plus theme. So be careful that, you are aware of that and that you will have to juggle possibly more than one key focus across your essay.
Yeah, and that complicates things. It used to be slightly simpler, but now it has become that little bit trickier. And I
think we've kind of said it all before, haven't we, sir, in class? But this is just about reading really carefully, reading twice always, taking a minute before you start planning anything to just ensure you know exactly what you are focusing on, and you give yourself that breathing space to start thinking about how you're going to line up those 3 key arguments.
So, and with leads nicely into, how to approach. Okay, we're going to take you right from the beginning here. The last thing we want to do is for anyone to make any mistakes. And it's not patronising. It's knowing what you're going into. Yeah, it's knowing your process. The wider eyes you can have, the calmer you'll be in the moment. So number 1, find the question. This one's nice and easy. It'll be literally the first one in the paper. Okay, so you really shouldn't have any problems there. As we've just been talking about, there are 2 questions available. Read them both clearly, okay? It used to be that the first question was character-based and the second one was theme-based. Seems to be a little bit more varied now. I haven't spotted any patterns.
No, I think they seem to have opened it up a little bit more. And the good news with this is that you have choice to play to your strengths. So you should always consider which of the questions gives you the best 3 lines of argument, where you think that you could show off your knowledge and skill set best before you commit to one. So as Sir has said, don't go rushing in, just give yourself that time to have a think.
Yeah, really pause and think about your whole essay. I mean, this is one we talk regularly about when it comes to the poetry. You don't want to start down that path and then immediately find yourself sort of running out of things to say. So take that moment. You've got time, okay, to sort of pause and think about where you're going for the whole thing. Once you've chosen your question, it's the obvious stuff here. Underline the key words. Don't make sloppy mistakes. You'll have all heard me say it in class, but we have had instances where people have read Mr. and Mrs. Burling as interchangeable. You will kick yourself forever if you walk out of that exam and everyone says, oh, it was Mr. And so on. Okay. Next, I mean, this one comes regularly, but pause and think. Really take that moment to have a breath, breathe in, contemplate your answers, contemplate your ideas, before you rush. Don't just suddenly start.
I mean, this is something that we talk about a lot, but it's about, and we use the analogy of football and being like match fit and match ready. You need to give yourself time to consider what you're doing carefully before you launch into it. We see students mostly making mistakes when they feel the urgency and pressure of the exam and they rush into getting the answer down. They perhaps commit to the wrong question because they haven't given themselves the time to really think carefully before making that decision. Okay, this is as much about how to make good decisions, and it's an important life skill for you as anything else.
Yeah, it's exam practice. It's not simply just answering the question. It's actually about the sort of concept of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Then's a really important step, step 5, but plan quickly and efficiently. Okay, you'll have heard Miss talk about this regularly in class. Compose your 3 main ideas. I mean, this is kind of part of your last process, really, but pausing and thinking. But my pleaded bended knee here, don't spend ages on this.
Yeah.
You do not. If you remember the quote in the moment, the chances are you'll remember it later as well.
And you will know if you've messed up on this in the past. I'm not naming names, you know who you are. And this is something that you can learn from. It's 3 key bullet points for the 3 key lines of arguments. You can write down some of your key quotations and key words that you want to include in your essay to show off that terminology. But you are literally only writing bullet points and key words.
It's words. It's sort of just little memory jogs that you'll look back later and you go, oh, I need to go include didactic or whatever. It's not sort of great big sentences and writing out full quotes
Certainly
and underlining and
half
analysing
a page
what you're
of
saying.
analysis, yeah.
We know where we are. Okay, so then have faith. I suppose that's a message of faith. Yeah, we believe in you. We know what you can do. Okay, and therefore spending ages on your planning is actually just harming your ability to write. We believe that you'll be able to write those answers with the analysis and with the context and with the quotes. You don't need to have that moment of doubt at the beginning. Then I would very much use your 3 ideas as a springboard for your introduction. Don't skip the intro. This is your moment to get your examiner on side. This is your moment for them to look at you favourably from the very off. Get in one of those key words, one of those buzz terms before you start.
But what I will add in here is I know that we've talked, in fact, in class today about how some students struggle to get their introduction solid and to feel confident about how they're forming it before they've worked on their 3 arguments. And I think it is plausible as a strategy for some of you to leave yourself that gap and return to write the intro after you've written your obvious alternative and bigger picture paragraphs. And that can be a really good strategy for some people. You must pick your lane here as to how you know you work best.
I'm more than happy. I just don't miss it. Make sure that intro's done and try and make it, that quality piece of kind of, where you're going for your essay. It'll get the examiner on side. And then next step, write. Okay, time to go. Read your answers as you go. Okay, make sure that you're kind of thinking about them as you're writing. Is your argument clear? Is it coming through nice and explicitly straight off the bat at the beginning? Have you probably referenced it as you're writing? You know what a good paragraph looks like. You've been doing them for years. Have you got context? Is there enough analysis? If it's not in the paragraph that you've just written, take that moment to then correct it in the next one. Make sure that you squeeze the next paragraph. Right, I need more in-depth AO2 stuff.
And on that, never cross out whole paragraphs of writing. Even if you think you have lost the thread of your argument, you can always redeem it and get back on track. The worst thing you can do is to cut all of the words that you have spent important exam time on out of your essay and sacrifice any marks that you might have picked up from that. It's a real kind of basic error that can cost huge amounts of marks. So please don't cross out, just redeem. Work on it, try and make it better in what you say from that point forward. And sometimes you have to accept that you might have to sacrifice a couple of sentences or an argument that you maybe were not completely satisfied with, but you can get back on track. You just need to keep writing.
Okay. So, the question today we're looking at, remember, is guilt and sort of morality. So on the web page, there's a series of words that we think might be useful for you. Some of them perhaps slightly more higher level. We've got things like repentance and penitence and callous. Callous is quite a good word for all sorts of texts. Actually, at various times can use callous. There's sort of phrasing like moral negligence. You would say that perhaps some of the characters' actions that are not illegal but perhaps immoral could be described as moral negligence, reformation, introspection, all sorts of words. You will know the ones that perhaps are less familiar to you that you can start using, remember, in your analysis. So we've said it all before, but this is not so much simply about what you say, but it's also about how you say it. And so having that professional phrasing is going to be useful to you at this point.
And I'd say it's often the marker of distinction between a solidly strong essay that is perhaps scoring a kind of grade 6 level and the students that manage to push up into the 7s, 8s and 9s, is your ability to write formally and fluently to make your arguments impactful. And part of that is having the right vocabulary. And this is why we provide you with the slide that you're looking at the moment, is so that you can start building that vocabulary into your writing to really push it up.
So obviously the delight of being online here is you can kind of go back to this, I hope, and write down any of these that maybe you want to use at a future date. And I mean, we had a few issues with the chat, and we were hoping that people could talk, but obviously if there's any there that you're not sure on, then just ask us, tomorrow or coming days or whatever.
Yeah.
So where do we see these ideas of guilt and morality in the play? So I'll deal with perhaps the sort of the overall kind of ideas, the role of guilt and morality.
You're going to leave me to deal with the spiritual, aren't you?
You can go spiritual.
Okay.
I'll go pragmatic.
Good.
Okay. So Priestley presents guilt as a catalyst for moral reflection, and I think that's fair to say. Is initially the characters are encouraged to kind of reflect on their guilt or their lack of guilt, and then this kind of drives them towards, whether they are behaving morally and whether they take any sort of acceptance for this at all. Whether there is an ethical code that runs through the entire play. And obviously all of this is steeped in social class and social manners and social behaviours and etiquettes, and it raises questions of moral responsibility that can be seen in remember, a sort of fundamentally Christian society at the time. Miss will talk about perhaps Priestley's own views, because he wasn't necessarily the strictest of Christians, but remember the audience that would be participating and the audience that would be watching this, fundamentally would, and so therefore seeing some of these sorts of ideas around Christian morality and Christian ethics reflected in the play is fundamentally important. Many people read the play with sort of ideas of seven deadly sins and repentance and ultimately redemption for a couple of the characters, and I mean, there's a famous quote from Priestley where he wonders, he says the ending is the key to understanding this play. And I guess that in itself could be read with a certain sort of religious significance and kind of moral kind of awakening for some of the characters.
If you don't mind me chipping in here, sir, I'd also add that, when we are using this idea about Christian morality in the audience, we're not wishing to diminish the kind of secularism that's happening at the time. We're kind of talking about culturally embedded ideas of Christian morality. So even if people weren't church-going or God-fearing in the way that they had been in the past, they were certainly culturally exposed to the ideas of the Bible and of Christian morality. So you don't have to be a practicing Christian to understand those ideas, and that's what Priestley recognises about his audience.
Yeah, and so in 1912, there would have been perhaps a slight sort of contradiction in people's attitudes towards moral behaviour, but also their outward respectability, particularly upper class, which would pertain to be perhaps more sort of nominally Christian, more religiously minded, and Priestley shines at times a fairly unforgiving light on this as to whether people might proclaim to be one thing and then behave in another way.
And this shouldn't be an alien idea. Think about Jekyll and Hyde, which is written not so far in time before the publication of your play here. So we're already exposed to this idea of hypocrisy, particularly in a class context.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the universality the play still has. I mean, I encourage you all to look around you to the world that you see today and think about, people saying one thing or wanting to be one thing, proclaiming to be one thing, and yet actually behaving in a way that is slightly at odds to that. So, this is universality of literature. It's why we love it. So by 1945, though, it's worth remembering that Priestley's audience had been shaped by war. I think it's always worth viewing this play with the kind of the ghost, the spectre of war hanging over it. You can't have gone through 2 world wars without having been heavily influenced by that and the sort of need for social reform, and how the audience would be perhaps more open to new ideas, having lived through something really truly tragic, and a more sort of collective responsibility there, which does align with those Christian ideas.
It's so interesting, Sarah, at the moment when, yesterday in the news there were significant changes in society in a European country, I'm trying to be diplomatic here, that were led by the youth. And we're led by a desire for great social change in that country. And you can turn on the news now and you will probably see coverage of it. But we're saying that essentially today we are not so different from the audience that Priestley is actually writing for. We too are an audience who are exposed to world wars. We too are an audience who I hope put faith in the youth to lead the change for the better for the future. That's certainly why we do the job that we do.
And so, yeah, these things are universal. They haven't gone away. And Priestley ultimately kind of looks at this sort of idea with a sort of the contrast between the superficial morality, the Burlings, Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling in particular, who are obsessed with their status, their appearance, their class, their wealth, with perhaps the deeper, almost Christian moral framework, which is based on compassion, humility, care, love thy neighbour. You know, the characters of Sheila and Eric, the younger generation, as Miss was saying, were much more open to building a sort of fairer, more egalitarian and equal society, whereas Miss Burling and Mr. Burling steadfastly reject this, sort of stubbornly, you know, until the end of the play. And Priestley sort of suggesting that guilt ultimately becomes a pathway to moral awareness. Guilt is the gateway, you know, to a greater moral kind of
redemption. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that guilt is an instigator, Sarah's saying. It's like a catalyst for change. And of course, the characters who can recognise guilt and sit in that uncomfortable feeling of guilt have the greatest capacity for that change.
So, we've got some more specific examples from the play itself. You know, the examples are fairly obvious, and we sincerely hope you're sitting at this sort of nodding along, and that's actually the aim here. You know this stuff. It's now just finding the way to utilise it fluently in your essays. So Sheila is the obvious example for someone who experiences, you know, very explicit guilt very quickly. She accepts the guilt, you know, and shows genuine remorse. You know, I'll never ever do it again. And again, this sort of Christian idea of repentance, you know, guilt leads to her moral growth. You know, remember Sheila's evolution, her dynamic nature as the play progresses, and how she becomes, you know, not just a more sort of outwardly looking person, but a more mature in every single way. The childlike mannerisms have long since disappeared.
I mean, think of it as like akin to Catholic confession, you know, this idea of owning your mistakes, of being able to verbalise where you have gone wrong, and then being able to grow and be forgiven in that process of acknowledgement.
Which I think is an interesting idea if you view it through that lens of, therefore, you know, what does the inspector become in that reading, you know, as this sort of voice who encourages the characters to be able to have the freedom to express, you know, their guilt and effectively confess their sins. The next character is sort of on the same scale, clearly, as Sheila. Eric initially hides it, you know, don't forget he leaves, you know, he walks away from his actions, but it's always worth remembering someone's journey, much like a poem, always look at the end, you know, but his actions ultimately lead to the confession and the acceptance of blame, which again, perhaps by Priestley, does give us a sense of hope and that redemption is possible, but it's only through his honest admission that is possible. If he didn't admit his sins, then he too would be a rather hopeless character, perhaps like, you know, some of the older generation in the play.
And I think it's really interesting, you know, a lot of my students have just written amazing essays on Eric and his redemptive arc. And it's interesting to see how cynical a lot of you are about the extent of his growth, because I think you've all acknowledged he does grow. He does seem to recognise his mistakes. But his distancing language in that still suggests that it is not a comfortable or easy process for Eric to accept that, which is why Sarah's put him second on the list and maybe not quite as high up as Sheila with her growth.
No, I think Sheila sort of reaches a slightly kind of more spiritual kind of understanding. Yeah, she's
Though personally, I think she's a bit more of a boring character, perhaps. She's controversial boring, yeah. Statement from me. But...
I know if you get into Eric, I don't know. There is something slightly churlish though by his sort of comments at the end about how he's, you know, willing to go to prison and so forth. You know, it becomes, I don't know, is there a naivety to his view there?
I think there is.
Is he just doing this for the sake of kind of the family family argument.
Okay.
But anyway, getting stuck into specifics. Mr. and Mrs. Burling, clearly incredibly static. They reject guilt. They rarely accept any sort of guilt. The closest Burling gets is purely, an attempt to save face and avoid scandal and blame. It's never true repentance. It's the equivalent of saying sorry and then literally doing it again. This isn't repentance. This is just kind of, a facade of kind of respectability that you're hoping in that moment. So they reject, moral responsibility of all sorts. And Mrs. Burling is obnoxious in this. She truly kind of seems prideful, in her
yes,
lack
I was
of
the
kind
only
of,
one who didn't give in to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a real sense that for the Burlings, they are a representation on that macrocosmic level of the Edwardian past and of the social class that they are representative of, the bourgeoisie. And I think that it's interesting that Priestley is casting them as an older generation who are now kind of outmoded. They don't have the capacity for change and redemption that the youth do. And that kind of leads us on to the unnamed character here, which is Gerald. He doesn't feature as a character who highly learns from his experience of guilt, nor is he a full rejecter of it, but he is the first to suggest that this is all a hoax.
Yeah, there's a sort of cynicism to Gerald. He doesn't buy all the sort of, the lines from the inspector. He's a complicated character to pin down. We spent quite a lot of time talking, about Gerald's actions, but his emotions are perhaps slightly trickier to work out. But it's always worth remembering that he is having an affair, so his moral framework perhaps should always be called into question.
Well, and I think that this is so representative of the fact that those who have privilege in life can find it harder to be forced into a position where you have to accept guilt and have to face consequences. And in fact, one of you wrote really well on this in your essay recently about the fact that privilege enables people to deny guilt and to maybe not be held as accountable as others would be.
So a few sort of symbolic characters to go along with it too. Ultimately these things are sort of intertwined. But the inspector, we can view him as a moral judge. He is a figure of judgment. I quite like that expression, a sort of prophetic figure. Mm-hmm. And again, he is Christian-like as a voice of judgment. I'm sure you all remember, his repetitions of members of one body at the end.
That reference to Romans 12 that we looked at. Yeah,
is biblical in nature, and so therefore these allusions kind of seem to be encouraged, and then him as this character of judgment on the family is a really interesting one.
And I think even the language that Priestley uses around the inspector is a language associated with biblical understanding too, the image of light, the motif of light. Think of your initial stage direction and the inspector as a bringer of light, much like Jesus as a figure associated with light, the light of the world. And so he's definitely directly paralleling that imagery with the idea of this Christian-like voice of judgment. I'll say more about why we're not committing fully to him being a Christian figure later.
Then we've got Eva Smith and Daisy Renton, who are very clearly sort of, symbols of the suffering of the innocent, whose mistreatment at the hands of the wealthy, the bourgeoisie here, it shows the explicit impact that they have on the people below them. She's used as a vessel here to try and create some sort of compassion from the Burlings, and obviously for some effect for some, but ultimately falls on deaf ears for the older family members.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the whole structure of the interrogation, again, it seems like an attempt by the inspector to inspire some sort of moral judgment. Each character is forced to directly consider their sins, their roles, their implication in Eva Smith's death, and then, reflect on this. And this is perhaps something that Priestley is encouraging us to do in general, is to reflect, on our moral behaviours and our moral outlook.
And we've talked a little bit in class about the connections between between these ideas about society as a whole, recognising our mistakes and learning from them, in relation to wider reading of Ouspensky and J.W. Dunn as well, who obviously write about the idea of like eternal recurrence of time, and this idea that maybe we are reliving our lives in order to learn from our mistakes and correct those errors. And I certainly think if you've got a question about guilt, using that knowledge that we've looked at those extracts, we've talked about those thinkers, think about the influence that that has on Priestley and the idea of having to learn from your mistakes in order to avoid a repetition. It's so important, and it's so useful to link to that context of war. You know, the one war leads into the Second World War, and this idea of mistakes repeating cyclically until we can learn how to be better people, until we can accept our guilt.
So the final message when it comes to that sort of thing, you know, Priestley presents guilt as essential to true morality. The two things are interconnected, they're symbiotic. You can't have one without the others. And just, you know, as a parallel, considering some of the allusions and some of the language that's used in the play, this does seem to align closely with Christian ideas. Yeah, it's an obvious opportunity for you to talk about the reception from the audience and so forth. But this is when Mrs. Spiritual bit will come in.
So, I mean, what makes Priestley really interesting, much like a lot of other intellectuals of his time, is that he doesn't limit himself only to being interested in Christian morality. Priestley had a kind of complicated relationship with the idea of a God. He was a man that I think you can best describe as being spiritual and well-read spiritually. But he doesn't completely agree with organised religion, particularly organised Christian religion. I think he morally accepts the ideas of Christianity, but he was a man who read widely on non-Western thinking philosophically. So he was exposed to Buddhist teachings, Hindu teachings. And I think that the best way to understand him and the play as a whole is not simply through a Christian lens. Effectively, Priestley believes in the moral universe, this idea that we are all accountable for the decisions we make and the morality with which we make those decisions, whether we are open to accepting our guilt and learning from it, or whether we deny it, push it aside, and refuse to grow spiritually. So really for Priestley, the play isn't just a play about Christian morality, nor is it just the story of one Eva Smith, as you will remember. It's many millions and millions and millions of the archetype of Eva Smith and John Smith. And what he's really saying is that we are all in a moral universe. How one behaves affects how another behaves. Okay? So I think it's best to understand Priestley from that viewpoint. And it's a more holistic, accurate reading of him as a man who is spiritual, but who is broader than simply a Christian interpretation. He sees this as something that is more worldly and encompassing of all different tracks of thought, whether you're Buddhist, Hindu, or Christian.
Yeah, and I think and again, this is the universality of the message. It's why, you know, we still enjoy this play today, and I think it's fair to say that from the texts that we teach, it's probably the one that goes down the best with students, because these ideas are recurrent. They don't leave. The final thing I'll just end on is the message that's expressed at the end there. You know, people often view the play as quite bleak. You know, these are all fairly sort of unlikable characters in many ways, doing unlikable things, you know, and yet it is, you know, through Sheila and through Eric that Priestley does end on some note of optimism. There is an element of hope that continues, you know, after the play perhaps is finished. You know, there is a suggestion that individuals can learn from their guilt, learn from their mistakes. And this would be important, you know, writing in 1945, that people have done awful things in the war, probably on both sides, if we're being honest. And therefore, you know, the ability to learn from, you know, our failures as people and perhaps as a society, and to build a better, sort of more morally responsible world is really pressing for people in that moment. And I think it's one that we could perhaps all learn from today.
Yeah, I think he essentially believes in redemption, that we can all redeem ourselves. So we don't need a God to forgive us or to redeem us in the eyes of Priestley. What we need is to be able to do it for ourselves.
So now a few more practical bits after the sort of background here. We've got some quotes on the board here. They're quite small for us, maybe for you too. We've got guilt leading to moral growth. So these are the ones, the redemptive quotes, predominantly from Sheila, as you'll see. I'll never, never do it again to anybody. The fact remains that I did what I did. You know, I'm ashamed of you. So all of these quotes are illustrating Sheila's sort of immediate repentance and her immediate regret for her actions. And again, this is aligning kind of with Christian ideas of accepting our sins, really, here.
And I think it's so interesting with that repetition of never, never. You know, we've just talked to you about the idea of that eternal recurrence of time theory, and this idea that you can kind of break a loop. And there's Sheila repeating in loop form her learning, her realization that she will never do this again. It's a beautiful kind of illustration with that epizeuxis that you can break a cycle if you can accept your guilt.
Yeah, and I think ending on that final word, anybody, as well, again, really sort of expresses this is something that she believes for the whole of society. It's not her, I'll never, never do it again to her, or, you know, even women. This is something far, far greater for Sheila. The next group of quotes, maybe we'll just have a look at one from each, you know, more so from Eric here. This is his honest acknowledgement. I did what I did. We've got that short sentence, that sort of blunt kind of language.
And I would add in here that the bluntness of his language is something that evolves and develops across the play, and it mirrors the bluntness with which the inspector talks. So in terms of seeing the influence of the inspector as a kind of paternalistic figure for Eric, you can really see that in the way that he starts to mirror the language of the inspector, that bluntness, monosyllabic kind of language choice.
And of course backed up by, we all remember the sort of the lack of paternal figure that he has from his actual father, and so therefore there is a sort of, you know, there's reading there as to why he's seeking that out.
Yeah.
We've got the denial quotes from Mr. and Mrs. Burling. It's similarly sort of, you know, blunt in their way, but these are showing a simplicity of thought. I did nothing I'm ashamed of, says Mrs. Burling. You know, there's no complexity to this. Is this sort of simplistic understanding from her, you know, which is also illustrated and mirrored through the sort of simple sentence. It's almost simple sentence, simple mind. You know, she is incapable.
Wow, what a slam.
She is incapable of, you know, seeing these things from other perspectives. And again, as we murmured earlier, you know, intrinsically proud of this factor.
Yeah, when we've talked about the 7 deadly sins and their kind of parallels with characters, and that kind of pride of Mrs. Burling has often been the one that people identify fairly quickly. You know, her outrage that the girl Eva could dare to introduce herself as Mrs. Burling, to take on her name, the kind of pride attached to that. Yeah.
What a slight. And then the buns from the inspector, which I'm sure we touched on this one earlier. We are members of one body. We're responsible for another. Yeah, it goes without saying. We've said it many times before, but I really would make the time to learn bits of that inspector's final speech. Not just because I think it's good for the kind of, you know, moral message of the play, but linguistically it'll help you out as well.
Yeah, there's so many techniques.
There's lots going on.
And of course the context that you can work in with that, but also the ability to kind of spot those allusions to Raymond's 12, and as we've discussed in class at length,
especially for you guys of sort of higher ability, there's greater ideas than just simply, you know, pieces of foreshadowing or whatever. And then lastly from the inspector, each of you helped to kill her. The word I'll highlight there is that I always find interesting is that word helped. You know, it's a sort of, you know, beneficial term in many ways, and yet here Priestley's using it with the inspector really quite negatively. You know, it's suggesting that help doesn't necessarily, you know, always.
It's a highly ironic use of that word, isn't it?
Yeah, he's sort of really subverting kind of their ideas around, you know, helping and being generous.
And again, to quote my students, it's been argued really well by a couple of people in their essays over the last week about that idea of highlighting the collective failure of the capitalists, like the irony of that they've all helped to kill her, that sense that community and all being joined together as a united force is a really socialist principle. And he highlights how they as a capitalistic family have ironically helped work together to destroy the life of Eva Smith, and that this is a really kind of clever argument that he's raising about the failures of capitalism, because when they do unite, they actually do so destructively. And of course, this is a broader point about what he believes about warfare, and warfare also being a collective failure. Okay.
So, a question, the sort of thing you might get. How does Priestley present ideas about guilt in Inspector Calls? So a fairly nice, simple one, but we've been given no ideas that the exam board won't go back to something like that. We talked at length earlier. You can by all means revisit it as to what we think the questions nowadays might look like.
It could have a character attached to it.
It might attach a character, which will make it substantially trickier, because then that obviously tethers you. Don't forget,
or indeed,
though,
the entire family. So how does Priestley present ideas about guilt through the Burlings?
That would be more manageable. Remember, though, you can always talk about, how other characters are in some regards contrasted. There is flexibility to this. This is why taking that moment to think earlier is really, really important. So obviously, keyword here, guilt. Okay. So this is your moment to think about your 3 ideas. Our intention was that people would ping comments across for their various ones, but I don't think that's going to work. So therefore, we might just talk you through 3 of the ideas that we potentially had for this. But I mean, I'm tempted to pause just for 30 seconds and think about what would you say? What are your 3 argument lines for this? The obvious argument, the alternative argument, or your nuanced or more subtle argument, and ultimately kind of your bigger picture. And remember, if you're ever struggling with the bigger picture one, you probably want to be thinking about sort of society, and grander and greater kind of ideas, or humanity. Either of those will work 9 times out of 10 for bigger picture. And remember, the nuanced argument or the alternative argument doesn't have to be the polar opposite. Sometimes people think that it needs to be kind of the flip. And it doesn't. It can just be a sort of examination of a slightly different element.
Yeah.
Sorry, something popped up. And that will be the aim of what you're going for here.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was talking to students about today was how to spot the differences. Sorry, that's the dog. He's just gone and got his toys. He's like, you are talking to other people and not playing with me.
He gave us 42 minutes. And he was like, no.
So I'm going to carry on and try and talk to you whilst you go and deal with the dog's toy. Thank you. So the obvious argument and the bigger picture arguments are a little bit tricky to separate. But for the obvious argument, you're really trying to demonstrate for the examiner that you understand the key, most basic interpretations of it.
I will take it.
Yeah, go and take it off him. Thank you. So for an obvious argument, you might want to begin with a character like Sheila and prove how she is a character who is able to make moral growth through guilt. Because she can acknowledge her guilt, she has the capacity for growth. And she's your clearest example of a character acknowledging guilt for moral growth. For an alternative argument, you might pick a character who fails to demonstrate that level of cognizance of their guilt. So it might be a character who, like Mrs. Burling, seems adamant and determined to stick dogmatically to her interpretation of, I know they know it too, I've used it a fair bit in class, yeah. So she's got a very dogmatic understanding of it. No, and it's not because of our dog. And finally, we've got the bigger picture argument. This is where you want to expand it to its more universal human teaching. So that's where you want to talk about Priestley's message about wider spiritual responsibility and the fact that I think he sees all of us as part of a moral universe. That doesn't have to be a universe overseen by a god, but it is a spiritual universe in which moral growth matters. And for any of us to have any hope of a peaceful future, and this is so true for the world that we're living in right now, we must all acknowledge where we have made mistakes and be willing to grow and change because of that. And he's saying that without that, those cycles of repetition and war will continue to erupt and boil on under the surface of humanity. So the bigger picture has to be those bigger spiritual messages that you're really trying to get in there.
And yeah, go big on that last one, but don't be afraid that there might be some sort of crossover. You might talk about society in those other ones too, and you shouldn't shy away from it. You're just going to make that last one the kind of real thread of your argument is about what Priestley is doing, as Smith says, on a spiritual level, on the grander scale, a theological level. You know, the biggest of all. You know, not just simply perhaps in that moment and at that one time. My argument, something not dissimilar. You know, guilt leading to moral awareness and capacity for change, as Miss was saying. Really, that's the Sheila point, isn't it? You know, she becomes morally aware. She is the one that's capable of
and
change.
You can absolutely have more than one character as a focus in a paragraph. Like you can move from Sheila to Eric. And I'd say that some of the best essays that I've looked at, and in fact I was mentioning one of the students to you, because he'd really packed it with embedded quotations and moved between characters really fluidly in his paragraph, so shout out to you. I won't name you and embarrass you on here, but I did speak to you today and I'm sure you know who you are. So, you know, that is a really strong approach. You don't have to limit yourself to making an argument just on one character.
And this is the joy of like leading with your argument first, is that then it gives you that greater capacity to be wider with your ideas and bring in those other quotes, because you're not just tethered to one thing, because the argument is leading the thread of your paragraph. And you can, especially if you can start jumping around a bit, as Miss was saying, the exam board love it. You know, don't get random with that, but like
no, but if you can spot those parallels and links between characters at different points in their journey across the play, if you can use very short micro quotations to do that, that's even better. What examiners love is seeing that you have thorough knowledge of your play, that you're able to quote from very small select examples and connect them across a paragraph to show depth of understanding of the play. It just shows that you know it inside out, that you're able to use those quotations and links.
Next, and again, follows a similar pattern. I've been a bit broader, you know, but effectively we can all see which character this is leading towards, you know, and denied by those that value status and reputation. And as Miss was saying, you know, this is a clear opportunity to talk about Mrs. Burling.
Or indeed Mr. and Mrs. Burling.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I would very much deal with the pair, you know, and then you can use, again, those multitude of quotes. You can talk about Burling's obsession, you know, with his status, and Mrs. Burling's kind of denial that we saw a little bit earlier.
Yeah, led by her pride. Exactly. And then the bigger picture that you've gone for?
I've gone with guilt reflecting the Christian morality of the audience, but Miss has talked me round, so I'd go for the bigger spiritual thing in general, perhaps reflecting Priestley's ideas here.
This is it. I mean, the reason that I've covered that with you tonight is because I want you to know that he wasn't a man who necessarily identified himself as a practicing Christian, but he would have been, like many of us, exposed to Christian teachings and is very much aware and agrees with so much of it, but has just difficulty accepting organised religion. So I think it's more accurate to refer to him as a spiritual man, aware of the Christian beliefs of his audience, but as somebody who essentially sees his message as bigger than that. It's inclusive of all of humanity.
And I think that's nice, because then you're doing both. You'll deal with the audience's response to the play, but you'll also deal with Priestley as a man, and you know, perhaps what he's getting across, that actually kind of moral awakening is far bigger than individual relationship.
And that, I think, kind of links with what we were talking about in class yesterday with Priestley's own words on the play. And I was saying to you in class that, you know, you can argue with anything that people come up with as a line of argument if you feel that you've got the evidence to counter it. But of course, the way to win any argument for your examiner is to use what Priestley himself has said about his own work, that it is no use using quiet small voices to call out injustices in society if everybody else is shouting. And his point here is that actually you kind of have to make your message didactic and explicit if you want certain change.
Yeah, and I think actually I was reading a review of the television programme in the newspaper the other day, the Telegraph. And it's, as you might know, a right-wing paper. And anyway, they were criticising it for being too blunt in its message. But actually, as Miss just quoted, if you dig into Priestley's own view, he makes no apologies for that. And that is part of the point. point.
My lot will be completely accustomed to me making just like, life points here. But in life in general, those who challenge what the authorities say when the authorities would rather you stayed quiet is exactly how dictatorship happens. And, Priestley is simply speaking his truth from another perspective that is maybe less popular today, but it's certainly still an act of democracy to use your voice to express what you believe in.
We'll move on. So the next stage, just to keep you going with it, remember it's not always the easiest with our Inspector Calls work. You're going to have to do a little bit more with a little bit less. There's some quotes there that you could practice exploding.
I think what you're saying is that, in comparison with something like Shakespeare, it's harder to look for those really obvious imagery techniques. So that simile, that metaphor, without just going to like bees in a hive, etc. And what Sarah's trying to say is that AO2 is incredibly important for you to get the high marks, and this is your ability to analyse. But you have to be more creative with how you go about doing that, because Priestley's language is much more realistic. Think about his style of theatre, the fact that he blends naturalism with non-naturalistic elements, and you kind of see this in the language as well, but it doesn't give you as much explicit imagery to be able to work off.
But I actually love it then when you do this, when you do it really well, and people talk about
really
the tone of the words and how they're expressed. Don't forget, you can use stage directions as well. So those bits in brackets before are really useful as to how the character says some of the lines. But I think your analysis is incredibly precise when you then start talking about how the sentence is structured, how the words are used, why certain words are used for a sort of tonal effect. It really, really comes across very well. So it's just a reminder to do that, to name any obvious techniques if they're there, still continue to try and explore those words, give the examiner what they want. I'm afraid treat them a bit like a moron, make sure that you are kind of facilitating that.
As an examiner yourself, you're not being dismissive of the role of an examiner, just to clarify.
No, you're just making sure that you are not giving them opportunity to mark you down.
No.
You're giving them everything they need. They can't judge your work and go, oh, they didn't do any word analysis. That's what we want to avoid.
And I think for Priestley, the kind of key areas that you must try and get in there are stage directions, as Sir has suggested. They're easy to spot and learn because they are often his adverb choices, which are bracketed in the text so you can see them very easily. And there are clear patterns in the kinds of language that he likes to use for those stage directions. Some of you have done that really well in recent essays as well. But it's also things like hesitation. I mean, we had a brilliant moment in a lesson this week where you guys were able to parallel the use of Burling's hesitations with his dashes that created that kind of impression that there were gaps in the logic of his capitalist thinking versus the inspector's use of the polysyndeton, that they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish, and his listing of the millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, etc., to kind of show that Priestley is showing that the inspector is using language that joins and shows community and collectivizes his arguments, whereas Priestley is also showing that Burling, in the absolute opposite direction, fragments his speech with those use of dashes. Now, that's the kind of level of analysis we're really looking for that 8-9 kind of grading. Yeah,
it's that specific, and remember always matching it to the purpose and to the event. Is it showing uncertainty from a certain character, and is it showing sort of confidence and certainty from another? But guys, I've read so many times people doing this, and when you nail it, you really do it very well. So take confidence. It's merely just a reminder. Okay, you're at a stage now where we don't need to tell you to do this stuff.
If you ever have a quote that you want to use but you just can't see a technique in it, my advice is to talk about tone of voice, like how you imagine that line to be delivered, what kind of emotion you think your character is feeling as they say that, and use that as your in for your analysis. So use tone. The tone of this, particularly this word choice, gives this impression of this character at this moment.
And you can positively work backwards from that. You like the quote that's on the screen there with, I did nothing I'm ashamed of, I imagine Mrs. Burling saying this in a very sort of haughty, kind of condescending way.
Yeah.
And then I would talk about how the simple, short sentence reflects her finality of thought. She is, closed-minded. She is unwilling to think of things from another perspective. And the simple sentence reflects how, she is unwilling to listen to others. And this reflects her sort of, her condescending view on other people.
And for my high ability lot out there that are really striving for those 8s and 9s, don't forget your phrasing like pragmatic dominance. Who holds the floor in the conversation? We've talked about Burling versus the inspector. Both are striving for that pragmatic dominance, but they do it in different ways. Think about symbolic entrances and exits too, like the significance of the inspector interrupting that monologue by Burling at exactly the moment he's about to build to the crescendo of his speech. And there goes the doorbell, and there is the inspector interrupting that pragmatic dominance at exactly the right point to try and teach him the lesson. Learn from your mistakes.
Mid-capitalist flow, isn't
Yeah.
it? And it's cut short. And so we end towards with a model paragraph. We probably won't read all of that. It seems foolish when you can hopefully see it on the board, But what you hopefully can see from the paragraph there, is that detailed analysis that we were talking about, taking the time.
Move our faces.
Yeah, I think I can move us away. Cheerio. Maybe. Does that work?
Yeah.
So, previously presents guilt, straight off the bat. Sometimes there's a tendency, particularly for you higher ability students there, that we almost shouldn't use the key word as though we don't need to. That's too simple. No, you should. Use the key word. Make it the foundation of your answer. Okay, don't shy away from it. Get that argument nice and crystal clear so the examiner again knows exactly what you're saying and exactly how you're doing it. Priestley presents guilt as a powerful catalyst for moral change through Sheila, whose response to Eva Smith's suffering reflects genuine emotion and ethical awareness shaped by a post-war, socially conscious perspective. We know immediately where this paragraph is going at this point.
And it's really packing a lot into that first sentence. If I was being picky and critical, which I always am, I would suggest that it could be punchier and shorter and more concise for effectiveness. But what the student is doing is they are immediately showing that they understand the context within which Priestley is making that argument about guilt.
Then we get into the analysis, nice and quick. So Mrs. Wright, I think the opening is a little bit wordy, perhaps, but it really shouldn't be any longer than that. Anything more, and you're perhaps beginning to ramble or bring in different points. Then note how it goes straight into our quote when she states that she will never, never do it again to anybody. We've got the repetition of ever, but you guys know it's even better if we call that epizeuxis.
Yeah, and don't feel like there are certain terms that are only for kind of like a level above you at A level and things. There is no cap in English. You have to stretch yourself and strive as high as you can with your knowledge to impress an examiner. Okay.
And then this goes on to do what Miss was talking about to some degree. It creates an emphatic, almost rhythmic intensity, which is dealing with the tone, suggesting the depth and sincerity of her remorse. So we're talking there about, a really simple technique if you view it as just repetition, but how that illustrates, her tone and her kind of reflection and mood in that moment.
And I think it's really important to add here that when you're mentioning methods, they are only worth a mark if you are explaining exactly the effect that produces. And you can see here that this student is doing that. They are explaining that rhythmic intensity, what it suggests. They give the emotional interpretation of this as well about the sincerity of her remorse.
Then it gives that next bit of detail. The extended focus on never also conveys permanence, so we've got that little bit of depth, implying that guilt has fundamentally altered her moral outlook rather than producing a temporary emotional reaction. So note how just fairly seamlessly the keyword from the question guilt re-emerges at this point. And talking about the finality and the permanence of the emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll note that the student also mentions tone specifically, just like we were saying earlier. If you're ever stuck on how to develop your analysis, go to tone of voice. Think about how that line should be delivered. What is the character feeling? And explain what that shows us. And you will note that towards the end of this paragraph, that focus on context comes back in with the point about Sheila as morally awakened in a way that aligns with Priestley's 1945 audience. parents who were increasingly aware after 2 world wars of the importance of social responsibility and shared consequence. So we've got that nice cyclical structure between student beginning, talking about what inspires the writing as being this context, and then goes back to that point before they form their final link, that through this Priestley suggests that guilt, when properly acknowledged, leads not only to repentance but also to ethical transformation. What a great phrase that is, ethical transformation, echoing broader ideas of moral accountability that would have resonated with contemporary audiences seeking a fairer, more compassionate society. Amen, Priestley. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And just sort of, general top tips, I guess, as we go. But the regular reference to Priestley, you'll notice quite a few times. Priestley presents guilt. Priestley's use of indefinite pronoun. Where else do I see it? I'm scanning
it's
it.
literally throughout the essay.
But mentioning the author's name is always going to, be beneficial to you.
And it saves
kicks you out of retelling.
Yeah, this is it. Not only retelling, but treating characters as if they are fully fledged psychologies, like you're psychoanalyzing them. You want to try and avoid that by using the author's name and using words like constructs. So Priestley constructs Eric as a character who has a redemptive arc in order to give hope to the next generation.
And that pretty much wraps things up for this evening, everyone. So we probably should have had some sort of final thoughts, but perhaps we've covered them in detail through the course of the last hour or so. We'll perhaps have to leave questions for tomorrow because we didn't have the opportunity. But if there's anything that emerged from this, and hopefully we'll find a way as well where this can be shared and people can revisit it if it's useful. And do let us know how it went and whether you found it helpful.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Yes, thank you one and all. Hopefully there are some useful bits there. Have a very good evening. Like and subscribe.